Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. Well, this is weird. I usually don't do the intro right after the bumper.
I'll do it.
No. You gave me a look, and so I feel that I must soldier forward into the awkwardness. We're excited that you're with us. Yeah, I don't ever do this part. That is weird. The role reversal. I can't even speak. This is a disaster already.
This whole thing is going to be a train wreck.
So last week,
You've got to listen now.
Last episode, we discussed Matthew 15 verses 3 through 9, and what we're going to pick up here today are the last couple verses after that, 10 and 11. As always, I think we always say when we're going to do like a small passage, we're always like, well, this should be a short episode, but that never ends up being the case. So we'll see. Maybe it'll be short and punchy, and we won't. Neither one of us will blow V8 at all, and we'll things will be sparklingly clean and perfect, or they won't. But anyways, Jason, it's kind of a continuation from last week. Is there any extra context that you would like to set or give dignity to Jesus and to the people that are hearing him?
I think that, so last time he was talking specifically to the Pharisees and teachers of the law. And I do want to be clean on something. I had not seen any of The Chosen, and then my wife and I basically just burned through it in about 2 weeks. And so now, every time I think about some Bible interaction, I'm like, is that The Chosen or the Bible? Like which? Because they're not exactly the same. And I think The Chosen does a great job. I've never been a fan of media presenting Jesus. It always falls short, but I think they've done the best I've yet seen.
Yeah. Which I do think, this is just a small aside, I do think this is one of those clear examples for why it's important not to be fundamentalist in terms of like what sort of content we consume or what sort of media we take in, but that our minds are going to be shaped by what we consume and what we take in. And that doesn't mean that you never watch Marvel movies or you never do any of those other sort of things. But it's one of those positive examples that when we allow our imagination to be pushed in a way that it usually isn't, which is away from the modern slop that we love so much. Mm-hmm. There can be a powerful. It can be a way that God speaks to us, and it's not something that would have been uncommon to the Jewish person of Jesus' day and age. There would have been stories that they, common stories of the Old Testament, and also common stories and myths that they would have all shared, and those helped shape who they were. So that doesn't necessarily pertain to actually, I think it actually kind of will pertain a little bit to what we're going to talk about today, in a way. But I think there can be a tendency because like, I know that there's some people my age who grew up with could never watch a movie or unless it was on one of those special boxes that limited turn the curse words into whatever, and you could set the extremeness. I think I had a friend where his box, if it said crap in the movie, like it did something, went haywire or something like that.
Right.
But it is to talk about how things like that. How allowing your imagination to be put in that place can be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I like that. And so, with that in mind, I think the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they set this up, and they didn't like it. We'll learn probably in the next episode, and we'll talk about they didn't like it and what's the outcome of that. But he's focused his attention on the religious elite, who also were the cultural elite, and that's, I don't know. In the culture now, we don't really honor the religious elite much, but back then they were feared and they were in charge of almost every setting they were in, other than Roman power. But outside of Roman power, they were the ones in charge, not simply of the religion. And they weren't, we only do this on Sabbath day kind of thing. They were constantly in charge. So they come in with power. Jesus has just told them, hey, you're questionable. They worship me in vain, basically, which would be a incredibly offensive thing. And then he calls the crowd to him. So there's an interesting thing that the I don't know if the Pharisees just left because after this brief conversation, the disciples come to him and be like, hey, you offended the Pharisees. So my assumption is the Pharisees move on. But this is something about Jesus that is very interesting, is everything is a teachable moment. And he's not afraid to offend. So this idea of Jesus being gentle, he is gentle, but he's also really strong. And I think that's just important. That speaks to a hang-up I have where somebody presents Jesus as only one thing. A guy will just, he's a revolutionary. He's always a revolutionary, which that seems to magically match up with the guy that's talking to me. Or he's always gentle and he never said any harsh words and he never really talked about hell. It was all just mistranslated. I'm like, oh, that seems exactly like you. And so my safeguard isn't condemning those two types of people, but just recognizing I can be that way. And Jesus is very strong and they're very gentle, but he's always looking to teach. And these are people that have been really, I'm not going to say beat down, but man, they are conditioned to when the religious leader speaks, you just better agree. And so what they say is law.
Yeah, and I think there's you spoke to a dynamic there of kind of us tending to pigeonhole Jesus. And I know I'm 100% guilty of this, of attempting to make Jesus in my own likeness. And I think, honestly, this is one of those things, we don't use the same language, but I think we do it to everybody almost. Like, I think a lot of human conflict comes into, I think a lot of human conflict happens because my image of what I think what I think Jason should be, is a very specific thing. And I think I know you well, and I think I try to give you dignity. But if I view my life and I view my relationships through a me-centered, a self-centered prism, and then suddenly you're doing things that don't line up with what I think you should be, I think that's where a lot of conflict comes into play. And I think that happens with Jesus. And I think that's always an opportunity that Jesus is asking us when those conflicts come into play is lean in. And similar in a relationship, Jason, if we have like a severe disagreement or I do something that upsets you, there's a choice to be made. And again, there's varying degrees to how this all works out. But oftentimes in intimate relationships, negative conflict is either the opportunity to grow closer or to push away. And I think oftentimes with Jesus, there's a similar sort of opportunity that when there's a passage we want to skip over or something we don't want to pretend is not there or it goes against how we want to view the world, that's an opportunity to either grow closer to Jesus or to push away from him. So with that being said, usually Jason reads, but since we're doing the role reversal, I will read and take on this long tome. And I think what Jesus says here at the beginning, I'm not going to get it because that's going to be what amazes me. So as long as you don't take this, then we'll be fine. Starting in verse 10, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. So, Jason, what amazes you?
I think what amazes me about this, and I do want to, for new listeners, I want to make sure you understand Amazed and Perplexed is about us just reacting to the scripture in real time. So this isn't studied dynamics. And as soon as I speak, you'll be like, yeah, you probably didn't study that. But I think it's important because we want to make studying the Bible accessible. And we believe this is simply a couple lenses, Amazed and Perplexed. So with that in mind, what amazes me is the fact that he is sharing something in just 2 verses that is mind-blowing. And it's mind-blowing to us in a different way, but to them, like I was saying, just as with the religious leaders being in charge of all aspects, not just the religious aspect, food and defilement and ritual law was such a big piece. And I'm not an expert in this at all. I'm not well studied in it. But I know enough about Jewish society that the Levitical system, the law that was set down in the book of Leviticus, that we have, the book of Leviticus, it monitored all things. And a big thing was cleanliness. And so this would be an incredible shocker. And I love that there doesn't seem to be, it's like, hey, everybody, I want you to know fundamentally, everything you've been taught, not really true. And it's like, well, wait a minute. And it's interesting, too, to me that you don't have a big pushback That's why I assumed the Pharisees were gone and the teachers of the law were gone. But this is a big deal. That idea of, Sarah, we talked about ceremonial washing. And of course, this is where Jesus is coming from. He's just had this conversation with them. And as he usually does, they have this one issue, which is pretty surface. And then he goes really deep and talks about their hearts and says, look, you're now providing worship that is just empty of meaning because you made it all about rules. It's what he just told them. Then he turns around to everybody else and he's like, look, it's not about what goes into you. It's not about what you eat, which it's drawing to mind. It's years from now when Peter has a vision in Acts chapter 10 where he still doesn't believe this. Mm-hmm. This is groundbreaking teaching in 2 sentences. And I've already used way more sentences just to describe my response to it. Jesus is just so amazing. This is, if I was trying to bring something that really pushed back on a lot of tradition, I would use so many words. Mm-hmm. And I think he delivers this in a way, so many times this is true, he delivers it in a way that they can hear it. They practice the opposite. If they're Jews, they practice the opposite of it, and they just let it percolate. Mm-hmm. And I wish I could communicate like that.
Yeah, that leads perfectly into what amazes me. He at the very beginning of this passage, Jesus called to the crowd and said, "Listen and understand." And I love that invitation for so many reasons. It's not, hey, I am saying words here, and there's a tendency in the historical stream of our church that the Bible is what it said, and it's plain. It was Jesus said in his plain English, and so you gotta interpret it like it is what it says it says it is, and in so many ways the way Jesus communicates, it's just a complete, and this is not new ground, but it's such a rejection of that way of that way of perceiving what God is doing around, like what God is doing amongst his people. I think going back to, when we talked about so many of the parables of the kingdom and Jesus continually going through the refrain, like for those who have ears, let them hear. And for Jesus to have this and say, listen and understand, there's an invitation to the crowd, to the peasants, to the populace, to the non-Pharisees of participation, of I am going to give you the dignity of not like again, for us, we can read this and we can have some pretty straightforward teaching from it for us today and age. But for them, they would not receive this as straightforward. They would have had so many things jump to mind of like, well, okay, what about in this situation, Jesus? What about in that situation? There'd be so many things that hop to their mind to reject or to question or to wonder what this could possibly mean for their lives. Okay, Jesus, if you're saying this, then what does that mean about what my cousin does, or what? How do I? Like there'd be this would not be straightforward application like it is for you and me. And so often in the way that Jesus communicates is listen to me and understand. To me, it rings so much as an invitation, and it's the beauty, I think, of all of Scripture. It's this invitation from God to like lean in, listen to me, and then understand and wrestle. Like this isn't the plain English. This isn't just Jason sat in the chair and okay, well, what's the real meaning? Like there's deep complexity here that God is inviting you to ponder in the mystery of.
I think so, and I like that emphasis that on the educating everybody or making it accessible. There are times in the United States history where if a woman was in the group, where a non-white person was in the group, there was almost an assumption they couldn't understand. We're not really addressing you. You're the lesser, And of course, children, adolescents, and adolescents didn't exist until 100 years ago or whatever, but
sure.
But that idea, the age existed, not the acknowledgement.
I'm big into the theory that people just cease to exist between the ages of like 13 and 19. That's my. I don't believe in many conspiracy theories, but that's the one.
That's interesting. So back to this, that dynamic of him, as you often say, giving dignity to everybody. This is an invitation that was pretty groundbreaking. Mm-hmm. Because the Pharisees were accustomed to issuing edicts, and it didn't matter if the people understood; they just had to obey. So this leads me to what goes into someone's mouth defiles them. That's the thing he's speaking against. What I just said. What is that in my life? What are the rules? Everybody would have said before he said this that, of course, he's not going to say that. It's just accepted. Why? Because everybody that I trust does this. Everybody that I know does this. And so what's the corollary for me now? What is it I'm like, oh, I stay away from that?
Yeah. Well, and I think it gets to kind of like the where I had my little aside, and I think it kind of plays into this, where there can be the fundamentalist, or not saying fundamentalist, I think there can be the natural human assumption to be like, well, like, okay, I'm talking to somebody and they feel like their life is messed up, their life is defiled. I'm like, well, let's take a look at your life. Let's just say health wise, you eat horribly, you don't get good sleep, you are constantly belittling people, you are like a bad employee, you consume porn, you do all these different things, and you're like, well, I can tell you why your life is defiled, why your life sucks, and it's because, and it's like, do all those things play a negative part? Do all those things that you consume or you take in, do they affect you? Like, of course they affect you. Of course they have an impact on you. But what I think one of the groundbreaking truths, and I think it's an ultimately freeing truth, is that ultimately, what is done to you, what you're forced into, or even what you voluntarily consume, does not have the final say on you. You are not just an automaton who is deterministic, and you are just a series of inputs, and everything you do is just naturally going to flow from things that have just happened to you. Like, there's so much dignity that Jesus gives here, if you extrapolate it out to say, like, I think about the kind of person that grew, and I know people like this who had horrific childhoods, just things that I can't even fathom happened to them, and like the way that life happened to them. By many standards, you'd be able to, like, they could have probably gone and lived any sort of life, and you'd be like, yeah,
I get it.
Yeah, why?
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't love it for him.
I don't love it. I wish things had been better, healthier, but like, I mean, how could you escape? How could you escape all that? But then I know people have lived that and are some of the kindest, gentlest, most loving Jesus people that I've ever met. And I'm like, I think one of the groundbreaking truths and what can be really amazing is when I think about those people and the evil done to them, and the evil that even sometimes there was some participation in. That those are not the things, like, they are not defiled. They are not defiled. They're redeemed, and they are part of all the goodness of the goodness that God is doing here now. And like, that has just got to be, like, if you begin to extrapolate that out, like that can just be so freeing and so beautiful to so many people.
Man, that you just totally exploded that for me. Like, its application is huge, so much so I'm like, what are you saying? And then I'm like, oh yeah, that is absolutely true. And you do find Jesus making these points. I'm trying to remember deduction versus induction. You know, I don't know which applies there, but he starts with this tiny point simply because it's what the Pharisees brought up. Mm-hmm. And we assume the crowd is listening, or else they have no context for what he's saying, which that wouldn't be the first time he shares stuff. They're like, now what are we talking about? But it is that idea of this is as a seed to the greater truth, mm-hmm. that we are not defined by our sins, whether sin done to us or sin done by us, that God's redemption is so incredibly powerful. And this is it. This is what speaks to me, at least. He's not afraid of your sin. I was taught to be afraid of my sin. And then once I was saved, be terrified of returning to it. And then I'd return to it, and I'm like, oh no. Well, then after a while, you're like, I don't know if I'll ever not return to it. I mean, I may do this the rest of my life. And then you give up. You know, you may still go to church, because, especially if you feel like, well, I'll go to hell if I don't go to church. But it becomes this really shell of a relationship. You know, like if I knew with my wife, she'll never be happy with me, like never. I mean, the potential for me to commit adultery is it just explodes, you know? But the fact that we forgive each other and we redeem the bad and we keep working and we trust God with all this, it keeps it ever hopeful and increasingly positive and deepening in its health. And if that's true about my relationship with my wife, how much more is that true about a God who can literally redeem anything?
Yeah, and I think if what can come out of you is what defiles you, like then the inverse is true. And like what comes out of you is good, it's pure, it's holy, it's the fruits of the Spirit, then like, man, what does that say about what God is doing in your life and the beauty that he can redeem? And so, yeah, like what I love so much is like, so often the Pharisees seem to come at Jesus from the negative aspect of like, well, they're doing this and that's bad and that's going to lead to negative outcomes, or God's going to be angry and there's going to be punishment. And like there is language that Jesus has around those negative side effects and the negative side, but almost to the other side, you could swing this and say like, you could swing this around when Jesus says, listen and understand. He is inviting them, and I think today, like us today, to extrapolate out, to think about, to understand, like, what would this truly mean? Well, if this is true, if this in this one sentence or these two sentences that he says, if that's true, what are all the meanings and what are all the implications for me and for my life? And it naturally leads to the idea, and I kind of got jumbled along the way there. It naturally leads to the idea that this is ultimately, like, this is a part of what God is doing. Like, this is why Jesus came. It's why God created the world he did, is because he wants to partner with us. He wants us to be part of the solution. He wants us to be a part of, of building his kingdom. And again, like, that's a lot to extrapolate. I'm sure there's many things I've said in the past 20 minutes or so that are not exactly correct, but I do think the wrestling here, I think is part of it. And it's not just like a part of it, or it's a fun thing to do, which it is fun to do, but it's like, it's a necessary thing where Jesus could say this, right? And then he could say, now listen, I am only talking about the ceremonial laws here. I'm only talking about dinner time and this and this and that. And so that's the extent, that's the complete extent of which I'm speaking. But the fact that he invites them to listen and understand. And even later on, we'll talk, he'll get very specific with people, very specific with, I think, Peter specifically later on. But even in that, there's so many opportunities to explore and wonder.
No, I think it's dead on accurate because of Acts 10, because, Peter has this vision 3 times and it's all food related. Food. Why? Because he was raised food. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Don't do this, must do this before, that kind of thing. And he gives him this food thing. And then when he wakes up, there's a knock on the door and Jesus says, I need you to make this connection. Mm-hmm. It's really a people thing. It's really a fullness thing, like this applies everywhere, not just to the food you eat. So I do think that's really sound, though I didn't think that 20 minutes ago. Sure. Like it was only after you said it, I'm like, wait a minute, that is consistently true. Mm-hmm. And I see this as Jesus' technique where he'll introduce a seed that you kind of, what is that? Is that really right? But then when you start to live with it, you're like, oh, it applies here, but it also applies to all these other places.
Well, and it's so silly because we think about other ways that Jesus is teaching, and we tend to like, I think I'm not going to belabor the point, but I think we've gotten a point across. So, Jason, what perplexes you?
So, what perplexes me is I don't think Jesus says it right, and if he was here, I'd be like, man, you need to work on that, and then I would immediately be both shamed and redeemed. When he says,
I think immediately he'd ask you a very cutting question, and then
he'd be like, tell me more about this part of you. And I'd be like, but when he says, but what comes out of their mouth, I would like him to say, but what you allow to stay in your heart is there. Now, I believe I'm not disagreeing with him, speaking honestly, I think he's saying it right. Number one. Number two, I wonder if he means what I think he means. Because what I would say is, if I were to rewrite this, but it's what you allow to reside in your heart. In other words, what you truly believe, that thing comes out of your mouth. So I would say what comes out of your mouth is demonstrating what defiles you. In other words, if I have a tremendous heart, then I'm naturally going to say tremendous things. If I love you, like truly love you, not just like it's opportunistic. If I treat you nice, then you'll treat me nice. Then I'm not going to say ugly things about you, or to you if I truly love you. But if I'm trying to control myself, oh, this guy drives me crazy, then eventually something will slip out. And that will show what's really going on in my heart. And so I just had a flashback. When I was in the Army, we had these ladies that would the civilians that would take our cards or something when we checked out. And so I'm in basic training and somebody cussed in front of her. And they go, oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am. And she's like, well, if you weren't cussing other times, you wouldn't cuss now, which is true. But in my mind, I'm like, I only hear profanity from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep. Like,
no.
I never know if it's just my words.
I'm ruined.
It's an onslaught of profanity. I'm like, do you know where you are? Anyway.
Yeah.
But it is that idea of I wish you would be a little bit more precise here for my sensibilities, which who am I? I'm nobody. But it is that idea. What I'm assuming he's saying is, you get all these messages, all these, whether they be 20 years ago or right now, that are ugly or not consistent with God. You take those thoughts captive, you make them obedient to Christ, out of 2 Corinthians 10. And then the stuff that comes out of you is clean because your heart is clean. And that matches other things he said. If your eye is pure, your whole body is pure, kind of thinking. What you take in is not the issue. It's what is inside of you that comes out that's the issue.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, there's where my mind goes is thinking about like your experience in basic training, where like that example, I think that can be the example like for so many of us. Like if we really begin to hone down on like the fallenness of the world and the things around us that are just so broken, and so far from what God wants them to be in his will, like it would be like, it would be easy even today. And I live a relatively, certainly in human history, very charmed life, to look around at all the brokenness and be like, oh man, what sort of hope like do I have, like beyond even my own personal sin, just looking at the brokenness around me. And like, again, I could look at my own sin and the ways that I operate that are completely selfish. But like, I think there'd be a sense in which like all the time, even the Pharisees, if they were truly confronted before with the defilement around them, would be like Isaiah crying out about their unclean lips. Like I think there's a sense for me in which like if I I do wonder if from God's perspective or Jesus' perspective, like, listen, you think these these washing laws that you have and the fact that you're not eating this or you're not eating and you are eating that and you're not eating that, like you think that is like what is keeping you clean or pure. Like you have to be, like you haven't even begun to see the world in the way that I'm seeing the world. And like, again, that can either be distressing to the extreme to go, oh my gosh, there's so much brokenness, there's so much fallenness, or it can be freeing to know like God is not holding me to the standard of like, God is not, God is not, I don't think God is that woman looking at you, saying that to the guy who cursed in basic training. And like, I think a lot of us kind of assume like that would be God's reaction.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I was with a guy today who hasn't been to church in a long, long time, and he cussed. And the first time he cussed, he was like, "Oh, I'm so," like it was a conversation ender to him. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so sorry, because he knows I'm a minister, and I'm like, yeah, I want to know the story. I want to know what's going on inside of you. If you ask me, should I cuss? I'd be like, yeah, you need to clean that up. You know. But it's like, you're going to die with a lot of sin, so I'm not going to make a big deal out of this, in the grand scheme. So what perplexes you?
I think I'm just confused in general, and I get that. This might be something that God is just constantly calling me or us to wrestle with and grapple, and to never have like fully balanced in our minds. But it's being wise and true to understand in life how our environment does play a part in our hearts. And there are things that Jesus taught, like you said, Jesus will talk about. The way, if we're fasting correctly, if we're practicing Sabbath in the right way, if we're praying, if our hearts are angled, like there are things that we do that we are not, disembodied people. Like our environment affects us and shapes things. And also holding the tension of the truth that Jesus is speaking to now. Like I think Jesus has wise words for both areas, and he brings them together at different points. But it's just an incredibly difficult tension I have. And maybe as I talk, like I wonder so often, it's like, do I hold this intention? I think for myself, I hold this intention better, but for others, I can't. Like my struggle oftentimes when I'm holding these two things in tension is to not wrestle with it like I would. Does that make sense? Like I assign more blame, or I want to fall on either side of not issue, but I want to fall on either side of this teaching. Like for me, I want to walk the high wire. Like I want to be on the balance beam. I want to follow the narrow path of Jesus, and I want to give myself the grace and the understanding. But for other people, I tend to want to end up on one side of the path. How does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And if I start talking and you're like, no, that's not what I meant.
It's certainly my fault. Jason, I won't share exactly what was said, but Jason said something earlier today that I was clearly, I'm not in the right headspace to properly interpret anything. So I'm glad that if you've heard that now, we're 30 minutes into the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. We're sorry.
It's already, I've already got the download, so it's too late for you to take it back.
There you go. So there is this part. I don't think Jesus is advocating, and I don't think this is in any way disagreeing with what you said, advocating. So don't pay any attention to what you take.
Yeah.
I think because that falls into another topic. He's establishing you're not defined by what comes into you, and he's using food as the example, but because of his other teachings, I think or else he couldn't go and sit with sinners. He couldn't be with tax collectors. He couldn't be with prostitutes if he thought that you got to be really careful how you regulate. And even when Paul talks about if you're eating food sacrificed to idols and somebody else isn't comfortable with it, don't do it around them, but you can do it. So there is this idea of as you grow in wisdom, you learn this hurts me and that doesn't. You know what I mean? So, but he's not suggesting nothing will hurt you. He's simply saying it doesn't create this reality of your in defilement, your lostness. This doesn't mean
it's not your
it doesn't
identity.
define you.
Yeah, and so I think the hard part for me becomes like I usually can hold that really well for myself. But then when it comes to giving dignity to the person across from me or other people,
so it makes it easier to judge them. Oh, they take that in.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's almost I find a lot of joy. There's like so much freedom and grace in being able to hold the tension or walk in this or grow in the wisdom of discerning what it is in front of me. How to hold this thing in tension. But when it comes to other people, I don't know if the discernment is just gone or it's just my grace towards other people, it tends to just be so much less. I mean, I guess it's true in so many aspects, but like I tend to want to take what Jesus is saying here, and basically do the opposite, but really dig down and boil down and reduce identity. And so again, it's not perplexed with what Jesus is saying, but it's just perplexion with me, and then perplexion with how to do this, how to listen and understand this wisely, and how to grow in the wisdom of walking through this.
Yeah, and I think that right there, I think is really the pivotal piece, is recognizing we learn in process. Somebody didn't say the name of Jesus to you and you understood all things Jesus. And even with where I'm at, that I've been working at this for, 30 years, purposely, like I really want to get close to God and know God, and so I've been working at it. I'm in ministry, so that allows me to do this 24/7. Technically, I don't do it 24/7 for the record, but it's always in front of me. Hey, how do I know?
I heard you were watching The Chosen, so obviously there's at least an hour a day.
Yeah, exactly. So that idea of we're always growing. That's really, really important about the stuff you do bad and the stuff you do good, but specifically about judging others. I think initially, so this is Jason. Jason at 19 was like, I do not judge anybody unless they say they're above judgment, and then I judge the heck out of them, especially Christians. And then I took on Christ in a real way in my young 20s, and then I transitioned to, okay, I want to have compassion, but I hit this space where if I'm denying myself and you're not denying yourself, whether it was very specific, the same thing, or in general, I'm like, now I have big judgment for you. And then I recognize, over time, I'm like, I'm not loving them. And then I hit a spot where I won't judge anybody, anything. I won't judge anybody, anything. And then I realized, well, wait, that's not loving to them to say, hey, whatever you want to do is fine. But I also don't want to convince myself the only other choice is to condemn them. I can't believe you did that. I won't talk. Let's take smoking. Oh, you're smoking. Obviously, you're too far gone, for the grace of God. And it's like, why? Because I didn't struggle with smoking, But now it's like, okay, I can go in better than I could 10 years ago. And I hope 10 years from now, I do it better than I do it now, to go to the, not to pick on smokers, but since it's here, to go into the smoker. I was with a guy today, and it was obvious he'd been smoking. And number one, it's low on my list, but I think it's useful for for somebody to say to him, hey, really care about you, and I know smoking hurts you. If there's anything I do to help you with that, but I'm not going to say that when I'm just getting to know him, So there is this evolution in all of us, or this growth in all of us, that we start doing it. You do something initially simply because you're told to do it. And then if you continue to really be a disciple and learn, then you cross over more and more. Well, I want to talk to them about this, not because I judge them. It's the opposite of judgment. It's because I want the absolute best for them. And so now I'm going to do it super humble, because I don't know what the absolute best for them. I have an idea. I can put it in front of us and work that out. And that goes back to my amazement, is how is Jesus doing this in 2 sentences? And it took me 20 minutes to talk about it.
Yeah. And I think, again, I want to reiterate, like, even there are things I said earlier in the episode where I'm now thinking back, I'm like, man, I'm not 100% sure about that. And there's part of me like, I'm the editing god here, so I could just go back and make myself sound brilliant and okay, which I won't. If you've listened this far, you know that I never do that to any great extent.
We leave in all the dumb things we say.
Yes. But also knowing that, like, man, there's so much grace that Jesus has for this, and Jesus, so often when he's inviting us to listen to him and understand and take part, he is not looking at you as like, it took you 10 years to get to this. What an idiot, Connor. What an idiot, Jason. And then knowing and hoping, growing that, like, I'll have more wisdom in this in 10, 15 years, and same for you. He's not looking at 20, 25. Oh, what a dummy. What an idiot. Can't wait till he gets to 2035, 2030. And we just I think we have this vision that that's what God is constantly thinking of us. And that's what God is thinking of humanity. And that's just not the God of the Bible. And so wrestling with this and listening as best we can and attempting to understand the invitation is, I think it's key to walking with him. So I hope this blesses you in some way. Grace, peace, and love.